In this lecture, we will talk about network interfaces, configuration files, and commands. Let's start with network interface cards, NICs. These are the hardware adapters that provide one or more Ether ports for network connectivity. NICs may be built in to the system board or are add-on adapters. They are available in 1 to 4 port configuration on a single adapter. 2 or more interfaces can be configured to provide bonding and teaming for redundancy. Individual interfaces as well as the bonding can be configured with IPv4 and IPv6 assignments by editing configuration files. In virtual environments, virtual interfaces are used and configured by editing these files. Network interface files. Each network interface has a configuration file that stores IP addresses and other relevant parameters for the interface. The system reads this file and applies the settings once the interface is activated. Configuration files are stored in a central location, etc sysconfig network-scripts, and the interface file name begins with ifcfg- or something similar and is followed by the name of the interface. Let's look at some of the examples. Let me bring up the terminal and let's look at this directory and this file. So let me cd into that directory, cd etc sysconfig network-scripts. And if I do an ls here, this is where you will see all the network related files. If you see right here, this is the file that I currently have. This is my NIC configuration file. And let's cat that file, see what it looks like. And this is what a file looks like. This is just an example. You may have a file which looks a little bit different depending on your configuration. For example, you will see an IP address there. You will see if there's boot proto is DHCP. If you have static, it will show up here as static or none. And many other settings that we will cover shortly. This is an example of 2 different Ethernet network files and the different configurations that you can have on there. For example, you can have boot proto as DHCP on one, and the other one you can have none or static. So to narrow it down, on the right hand side, I have each field defined, or most of the useful fields that you would need to configure in here and what they do. For example, boot proto is equal to protocol, and you can have the settings such as none, static, or DHCP. Then you have default route, IPv6 default route, and this means interface is set as the default route or not. Then you have IPv4 failure, IPv6 inet. The interface is disabled or not. This is depending on the setting you choose in here. Then there's also a HWADDR, and that's the MAC address. Then you can have the IP address. Then you can have the gateway in there. Then you can have a DNS setting. If you have a DNS in place, then you can choose to do DNS. On one of the configuration files, if you see on the left hand side, the DNS one is set up in here, right above the MAC address. And you also have nm_control setting to allow network manager service to modify this file. And you have on boot setting to activate if this interface you want to boot at the system boot to keep it activated. You have user control setting, you have UUID setting, and the type of the interface that is, and there are many settings, and most of the useful settings are already listed in here, which you can look at and compare. I would advise you to look at your network interface configuration file and just look at it, get more comfortable with it, look at the settings, how it's set up. In an actual work environment, those settings may be different, and looking at this will help you when you are configuring your network interface files. Let's talk about some other important network configuration files. These include etc hosts file, etc resolve.conf, etc sysconfig network file, etc nsswitch.conf file, and let's talk about each one of them separately so you can have a better idea. etc host file. This file associates host names with IP addresses. It resolves or looks up an IP address when the host name is known. For example, this is the example of what I have in my settings on one of my servers. And I'll bring up my terminal to show you how my file looks like. So if I do a cat on etc hosts, if you see right here, I have a server in here, test.example.com, and the IP address. Now I can already connect to the server with the IP address, but if I wanted to connect to the server with the name, then I would need to have this entry in this file if I don't have the DNS working. So this is how you can connect to different servers by names, and you can add more servers in here. And this is just an example. Let's say you had a server called CentOS. You can type that name in here with the IP address in this format, and then you'll be able to connect to those servers by using just the name. And the next configuration file we'll talk about is etcresolve.conf. The resolver configuration file provides access to the name server or your DNS server name. This file usually has two lines, one line specifying the IP address of a DNS server or the name server, and the other specifying the search domain. Lab environment may show only one line because that's how I have configured it. Let's look at the example. If I cat etcresolve.conf file in a regular environment, then you will have something like search example.com, and then you can have the name server and type in the IP address. Let's bring up my terminal and let's see how mine looks like. So if I do cat on etcresolve.conf, this is what I have in my lab currently. This will act as your name server. So 192.168.1.1, that's acting as my name server. If you have a lab environment, a lot of times you will have similar setting in this file, and this is what it looks like. But if you're in a regular work environment and you're working for a company, you may have to change that. So for example, you can have search example.com depending on your server name that you want to mention here, and the name server that you have of your DNS name server. And you can have more than one. And this is how this file looks like. Name server helps you to resolve that address or website that you are trying to reach. Your lab environment may show 192.168.1.1 or something similar. This is your gateway, but it is also acting as your DNS address. Next file is the network file, etc sysconfig network file. This file specifies global network settings. Example, if you cat that file, you may see something like that in there. But if you're using your lab environment, by default, it's probably going to be blank. So if I bring up my terminal, let me cat that file, cat etc sysconfig, and the file is called network. If I hit enter, I don't currently have any settings because I chose my lab to choose all the default settings, and there's nothing in there. But this is where you will come and modify it if you wanted to change that setting. Next file we want to talk about is the etc.switch.conf, name service switch configuration file. If you look at on the right hand side, this is the example of that file. It maps system identities and services with configuration sources. So if you see on the right hand side, that passwd means it's etc passwd file. That's what it's looking at. Also the etc shadow file, etc group file, etc host file, and this is what it looks at. In the example output, you can see it's mapping to these files. As I mentioned before, passwd, etc shadow, etc host file. And let me bring up my terminal and let's look at that file. Cat etc.switch.conf is the command that I'm running. And this is the file, and this is what it looks like. I already have an example of it on the PDF that you will be provided with, but this is how it looks like, and this is how it compares and checks all the settings in these files. Network Manager. It is the interface configuration and monitoring service. You can use command nmcli or nmtui, the text tool, to manage interfaces. For example, you can use nmtui to edit an interface or change your host name by just running nmtui command. And once you run it, this is what you will get. This is where you can go and edit a connection or activate a connection. So let me bring that up, run it, see what it looks like and what it can do for you. So on my terminal, I'm going to run the command nmtui, hit enter, and this is what you will get. Now, you can use your up and down arrow keys to choose an option, or you can choose to edit a connection. So if I hit enter on here, it will give me all the choices I have. Currently, it's only showing one Ethernet adapter that I currently have. And then I can go on the right hand side and click on edit it, or delete it, or make any changes to it. And this is how you can use that file. To go back, you just go to back, hit enter, and then you're back. took a quit out of it, you just go and highlight quit and hit enter. And then you're out of NMTUI utility. And this is how you can do that. This is how you can use this interface, NMTUI, and configure your Ethernet adapters or modify them. Another important utility is NMCLI. After making changes to the configuration file, if you were changing anything related to your network configuration, then you can run NMCLI con reload to activate the new configuration. Make sure you run that. The commands have changed from previous Red Hat, CentOS, Linux systems. Some commands still work, but you may want to use this command after making changes to the configuration file, and use this command. To create a connection with the name Ethernet, for example, if you want to call your new adapter ETH0 or NPS012 or whatever name you're giving it, you can run this command. And you can also choose what your IPv4 address is going to be. You can also mention your default gateway. To do that, you can run the below command, nmcli con add con-name net-eth0, and depending on your adapter name, this can be different over here. If name, eth0, type, Ethernet, IP4, then you mention the IP address that you want to give it, or the range, and then the gateway name. And this is how you can create a connection with the name, Ethernet, and the IP address, and the default gateway. When you run it that way, it may not be permanent. To make it permanent, you may want to go and modify your configuration file, which is an etc sysconfig network-scripts, which we looked at earlier. To remove a connection, you can just run nmcli con del Ethernet and then mention your Ethernet adapter's name. And this is how you can remove a connection. Furthermore, you can use nmcli device show to get complete information about your known devices. You can also use nmcli connection show to get an overview on active connections. So let me bring up my terminal and let's use some of these examples. So for example, if I run nmcli connection show, hit enter, this will give me an overview of my active connections. As you can see, there's one Ethernet adapter that we looked at earlier in the file we looked at, and this is how it's showing us. Then you have some other connections. For example, it's showing a wired connection, and it's also showing a virtual adapter, which you don't need to worry about the virtual bridge right now. This is the outside of the scope. If you're not using a virtual environment, you may not see this one. But this is where you can see all your configuration files. If it's a new system, you just want to go and see how it's configured, you can easily run this command and it can show you your current connections. Now let's talk about the commands. As I mentioned earlier, commands have changed from previous systems to newer systems. So if you're using Red Hat 5 or Red Hat 6 or CentOS 5 or 6, some of the commands have deprecated, even though they may work on some new systems, but it's recommended to use the new commands. So for example, IPA, IP space A, or IP space ADDR will do the same thing, and it will show you the interface and their IP/MAC address, etc. So let me bring up the terminal and let's run this command. So I'm going to run IP space A. When I do that, it will show me the MAC addresses, the IP addresses, my Ethernet adapters, and all the configuration settings I have related to my network configuration. And this is the command you can run to look at that. Let's move on to the next one. So you can also run IPA show, and then you can mention the Ethernet adapter's name to see info on a particular interface only. So let's run that and see what it looks like. So I can run IP space A show and the name of the adapter. In my case is ENP0S3. If I hit enter on that, it will give me the information about that particular interface only. If you have a different name, then you can run it with that name and it will show you the information of the IP address, the MAC address, etc., and how it's configured. And you can also use this command to add an IP address. So for example, you can run IP space A or IP space ADDR, then type in add and the name of the IP address, then type in dev and name of your adapter to assign an IP to an interface. You can use it that way to assign an IP to an interface as well. If you're short of time and just want to assign a temporary IP to your interface, you can run it that way. To change the state of the device to up or down, so for example, if your interface is up, it's working, it's activated, but maybe your IP address changed or you just applied a setting. After that, you need to bring the IP down and then back up again. In order to do that, some commands have changed. The new commands on your systems is IP, link, set, dev, enp0s2 or 3 depending on the Ethernet adapter name, and then type in down. When you do that, your interface will go down. To bring it up, you can run the same command with, instead of down, you will type in up to bring it up. The older systems used to run the command ifconfig, and then you type in the Ethernet adapter name, and then you type in up or down. This may work on newer systems as well, but it's not recommended. Now let's look at old versus new commands. And this will be very useful to you because in a regular environment, you may have servers. Some of them may be CentOS or Red Hat 5 server. You may have a server which is CentOS 7 or even Red Hat 8. So you need to know the older commands to work on older system and the newer commands to work on the newer systems. So for example, if config has been changed with IPA, if config down, after mentioning the adapter name, has been changed to a newer command. And I've written these commands down. You will provide these commands in a PDF format so you can keep a note of these, maybe print these out in case you need to work on an older system. Then you know which commands you need to run to maybe quickly add an IP, maybe to bring a network interface down or up. And you can compare and use these depending on the system that you're working on. Again, this is just to make your life a little bit better and faster if you end up working on older systems. If it's just new systems, then especially in your lab environment, just to use the new commands and see how they work and practice them. Maybe add an IP, remove an IP, or just look at these, at least be familiar with the commands so you can bring an adapter up or down, add a new IP, etc. I hope you learned something useful in this lecture as well, and I'll see you in the next one.